This quotation about Romeo is so important because it helps establish the play as a tragedy. Now, in Greek tragedy, the tragic hero tries everything in their power to avoid their fate. But their hamartia, their fatal flaw, means that every choice they make, ironically, brings their fate closer. But here, in Shakespeare's tragedy, the hamartia is the character's hubris. Hubris is pride before the gods. It's taking the gods for granted or challenging them. So in Shakespeare's tragedies, they refuse to escape their fate and often, like Romeo, seem to rush towards it. Romeo's hubris is that he ignores fate's warning and goes to the ball anyway. This is Shakespeare's way of showing that the tragedy is Romeo's fault. He had the choice not to go, and he deliberately challenged the gods and the fates, and so the consequence is death. Now, you may want to talk about language features. So in the first line we have, my mind misgives, and so the alliteration emphasises the mistake he's making. The consequence yet hanging in the stars is a metaphor, and hanging we associate with death. Quotation number 2, Romeo is seeing Juliet for the first time. Although Romeo celebrates Juliet's beauty, the imagery is also full of warnings of fate. Her beauty makes the torches burn brighter because she is so bright. But comparing her to a torch's light also invites us to associate her with a flame which will burn too brightly and then die. Juliet is also an exotic figure, like a rich Ethiopian would be in Elizabethan London. But this Ethiopian is also racially different, a symbol of conflict, of not fitting in, a clue that Romeo and Juliet's marriage is not a good match. Shakespeare returns to this racial conflict in his play Othello. The idea that her beauty is for earth too dear also implies that she will only find a home in heaven. Again, this implies she's going to die. Then the dove is chosen for its symbolism with love, and also whiteness symbolises purity in this image. But snowy doesn't just imply whiteness, it's also cold and wintry and again suggests death. So too does the symbolism of being surrounded by crows. Romeo means it to show how ugly all the other dancing women are compared to Juliet, but the symbolism of crows depends on their blackness. This, of course, is another reminder of death. It also makes the Ethiop's blackness a link to death as well. So the symbolism Romeo keeps using to describe the woman he's in love with also continually suggests her death. This is another subtle way that Shakespeare is pointing out that Juliet's fate and Romeo's fate to die is begun by Romeo. He is responsible. This is packed full of language features, of course. You could comment on the alliteration of teaches and torches or burn and bright. Obviously, her beauty is described in this metaphor, which I've already dealt with. And the final line introduces sibilance, which, as you know, either creates a feeling of peace or sinister threat. And you could argue either way here. Romeo says these words after Mercutio has been killed and he's deciding to get revenge by killing Tybalt. This is a massive turning point in the play because if this didn't happen, Romeo wouldn't get banished. If Romeo didn't get banished, Juliet wouldn't take the potion and she would not have died. So this structural feature is a way for Shakespeare to say Juliet is an innocent bystander here and Romeo is the cause of her death. He accuses her of making him effeminate. So much for love. Who does he blame for Mercutio's death? Juliet. Yep, just as Eve ruined Adam, so Juliet has ruined Romeo, emasculating him. She has caused him to go against his male nature and adopt an inferior, female, effeminate nature. That's the way he sees it. He has lost his valour. Shakespeare links this directly to Romeo's killing of Tybalt and the cause of the tragedy. rather than using Juliet as a reason not to kill Tybalt, because after all they're related, Romeo now uses her as the reason why he must kill Tybalt. So, Shakespeare is deeply critical of this view of masculinity and of this dismissal of peace and non-violence as a female characteristic. He seems to be saying, Romeo, you fool. Stop adopting this masculine persona. It's going to lead to tragedy. And obviously that links to the flaw of masculinity in the play as a whole. These lines are part of a sonnet that Romeo and Juliet share when they first meet. Although we would expect Romeo to seduce, to woo Juliet, because this is a patriarchal society after all, it comes as a bit of a surprise to see that she is in charge of the seduction. In these lines, she's manoeuvring Romeo towards kissing her lips instead of her hand. So she's planned the reply he's going to give, but more importantly, the kiss that he's going to place on her lips. She manoeuvres him into marriage, and this is the first way she does it. It's that old Adam and Eve original sin all over again, the woman leading the man astray. Now that's one interpretation that Shakespeare's audience would be ready for. But I prefer the interpretation that Shakespeare is attacking that patriarchal view of women's greater capacity to sin. After all, what forces her into marriage? It's not her own stupidity or her own lust. It's that patriarchal society prizes virginity so highly. So she must keep her virginity until she marries. What forces her to marry so quickly? The patriarchal rush to get her married to Paris. She rejects the idea of an arranged marriage and would like to choose her own destiny, her own fate. Of course, fate has another idea because that leads to her death. But the point Shakespeare is making is that she ought to be able to choose her own husband. So, marriage to Romeo is the only logical escape. And we also have the added irony that Juliet presents herself as the statue of a saint, which of course is a kind of blasphemous idea. It's going against religious teaching, and it's using religious imagery to suggest that he ought to kiss her. So it's using Christianity to justify lust, which again the audience would be rather shocked at. So for many parents in the audience, Romeo and Juliet will deserve their fate, although I think Shakespeare is arguing against that. In this quotation, Juliet manoeuvres Romeo much more quickly towards marriage. We can see from this that she's totally planned what he's going to do, and he's only been in front of her for a few minutes, which suggests that she may well have thought this through before. So, let's talk about the patriarchy and Juliet's forward thinking. She knows that she and Romeo think they're in love, and they definitely want to enjoy sex together. But she insists on marriage because that is the only way society will allow her to enjoy sex. Now, what's interesting here is Shakespeare himself did indulge in sex before marriage and got Anne Hathaway pregnant and then married her. So he's fully aware of the social conventions and how difficult that makes things for the woman. Juliet knows that her parents are likely to make an early marriage with Paris. So again, another reason to have a marriage to Romeo arranged by tomorrow. She knows her parents are kidding her when they suggest that she's got time. She knows they're going to rush into this marriage. It comes as a surprise in terms of the play because Capulet has these delaying tactics with Paris. But Juliet never for a minute thinks that there'll be any delay. That's why she moves so quickly with Romeo. As soon as she finds that she loves him, he's the man I've got to have because that will stop me having to marry Paris. She also realises that Romeo lives in the same patriarchal society that she does, and in those rules he would not be allowed to marry for love because his status as the son of a lord means that he will have to marry for wealth and status as well as beauty. Love, she knows, won't be enough for the son of a lord. So she cunningly reminds him that he will have all my fortunes. Now this metaphor does imply my good luck, that sort of fortune, but even more importantly, it spells out that he will have all her wealth. And so she includes that other meaning of fortune. It's the equivalent of a marriage vow for better or worse in sickness and in health, but it adds in that extra bit of cash. This makes it slightly less romantic and more of a financial exchange, because that's the patriarchal world we live in. And we know this has a huge impact on Romeo because he actually arranges the marriage to take place tomorrow, rather than simply coming tomorrow with an arrangement for a marriage at a future date. So he accelerates. He is desperate to marry Juliet because, of course, he can't have sex with her as a virgin unless they are married. It also prompts him to tell Friar Lawrence that she is the daughter of rich Capulet. The financial exchange suits him very well. There's no reason for him to refer to Capulet as rich, because obviously the friar knows who he is. He's used the word rich because Juliet's words here have had a profound effect on him. And it's also a way of telling the friar that the marriage is a great patriarchal match which his parents would definitely support. If only Juliet were not a Capulet. Our next quotation also reveals a lot about patriarchal society. So Juliet is just about to be kicked out of her house, if we believe Capulet, and she's begging him, "Good father, I beseech you on my knees, hear me with patience, but to speak a word." Baz Luhrmann portrayed Lord Capulet as a drunk in this scene. He noted the sudden change in marriage plans to Paris, from "I'm going to wait 2 years" to "I'm only going to wait 2 days." And he decided he needed an extreme reason for Capulet's extreme change of mind. But Shakespeare doesn't portray Lord Capulet as drunk or violently abusive. Instead, he's much more interested in the patriarchal reasons for this change of mind. Shakespeare made a deviation here from the source poem, where the marriage is actually Juliet's mother's idea, because Shakespeare's interested in the male agenda, in the patriarchy, and so he makes sure that it's Capulet's idea, because this shows that Juliet becomes Capulet's property, which he feels he can give to his friend. Juliet knows that she is powerless in this male world. She has to call her father good, even while he's threatening to send her out into the streets to become a beggar or a prostitute. She literally gets to her knees as she would if she were praying in church. And this dramatises how male power is seen as like the power of God if you were a woman. And it shows how much control males, and here a father, has over a woman's life. She asks, ironically, for as little as she could possibly get. Nothing physical, nothing that would cost him anything. She just asks for one single word. But he refuses to listen to even that, while he rants at her, insults her, and threatens her for numerous lines. By denying Juliet a voice, Shakespeare shows how all daughters are potentially denied a voice in this patriarchal society. She says, "Hear me," and the iambic pentameter puts the emphasis on me. It's a plea for identity, and for her own identity to be seen by her father as an individual, as a person, rather than a commodity to be sold to Paris. Shakespeare's point is not that Juliet is unlucky in having this particular unreasonable father. His point is that all father-daughter relationships in the wealthy classes are just as unlucky as Juliet's. So he's using this scene to criticise society in Elizabethan England. I've chosen this quotation for Capulet because at first he seems to be a very reasonable father. He's telling Paris that she's 2 weeks away from her 14th birthday and he ought to wait for 2 more summers, 2 more years until she's old enough to get married. That incidentally would make Juliet 16, which is the same age as she is in Arthur Brooke's source poem. So why does Shakespeare suddenly make her 14? Well, we have strong reasons for believing the play is an attack on masculinity in Shakespeare's day. So, to best dramatise patriarchal injustice, Shakespeare creates Capulet. Remember that the decision to marry Paris after Tybalt's death was originally, in Brooke's poem, Lady Capulet's idea. But of course this didn't suit Shakespeare because he wanted it to be the father's and therefore the male's decision so that he could show how male control was damaging. Here we see him being apparently reasonable, asking Paris to wait 2 more summers before marrying Juliet. True, Juliet will still be 16 and therefore very young, but that's significantly different from being not yet 14. And let's weigh up what he stands to gain. A very rich and influential groom who will boost his own family's fortunes and his political influence because Paris is a count and is also related to the prince. So this alliance will also strengthen his position in the feud with the Montagues. Now, asking Paris to wait 2 years is a real risk. As such an influential bachelor, Paris can have his pick of brides from more eager fathers. So we really do get a sense of Capulet trying to do the best for his daughter within a patriarchal system, even when he's got a lot more to gain by marrying her off so young. But next we have to consider how he describes what she will be like at 16. We think her ripe to be a bride. This metaphor of harvest objectifies her. It embodies the idea that she must be sold at the right time, like a ripened fruit. Ripe is also a sensual adjective. It invites Paris to think about colour and texture and taste. The metaphor suggests that Juliet is being grown to be both consumed by a man to satisfy his appetite and to bring him pleasure. So, even in the best case scenario, Capulet still thinks of his daughter as an asset like a fruit to be traded or sold when the time is right, and his description of her invites Paris to think of her sexually, even as he's rejecting the possibility of marriage at this stage. In our next quotation, we're going to see that sudden change, but also how he sees his daughter as a sex object. He tells her, "But fettle your fine joints 'gainst Thursday next." In this insult, we can see that Capulet sees his daughter entirely as bred for sex and reproduction. The metaphor of her having fine joints comes from pottery, as he wants to mould her entirely to his and Paris's desires. Focusing on her joints also invites her to think about her hip girdle, the physical joints in her body. The choice of verb fettle continues the pottery metaphor because fettle means to shape. But it's also chosen because of the alliteration, which is fricative. And this repetition of F clearly has sexual overtones here. Again, I won't say the word because it's a family show. It is a clue that he sees his daughter's sexuality as being the lure to attract Paris as a suitor. Next, he threatens to drag her on a hurdle. Being dragged in public on a hurdle, as in this illustration, was a punishment for traitors as they were taken away for torture and possible execution. He sees her as dead meat, as carrion. So on the one hand he's threatening her with death, but on the other hand he's revealing what he thinks about his daughter's body. It is simply meat, disposable, that he can give away for someone else's pleasure. He sees her as carrion at the minute because he will get nothing in exchange for this meat if she refuses to marry. She's baggage because her worth is only measured in what she can bring him through marriage. Without the marriage, she's simply occupying space and is a drain on his finances. All these metaphors point to her proper role in the patriarchal marriage, which is to enrich her parents through an advantageous alliance. In other words, there'll be many fathers in the audience who are not shocked by Capulet's behaviour, because patriarchal society would view a noble daughter's refusal to marry as betraying the family's interests. Shakespeare uses Mercutio to explore ideas of masculinity in this male-dominated society that is obsessed with male honour. Here he's outraged that Romeo won't accept Tybalt's challenge to a duel. Notice that Mercutio's first disgusted adjective is calm. This indicates how much he loves conflict. Calm is boring. He's also passionate about the same ideals of male honour as Tybalt, where reputation is everything. Not to stand up to a duel is a vile submission because, in this male moral code, it means that you are admitting another man is more powerful than you are, even if their social rank is lower. Tybalt has a lower social rank than Romeo, and so it is inconceivable that Romeo should back down. To do so is dishonourable in this male code. So, why does Mercutio fight? He isn't going to restore Romeo's honour by duelling with Tybalt. He has at least two reasons. The first is, as we've seen, he hates calm. The second is that he believes Tybalt will be easy to defeat, because he has not learned to fight real opponents. Instead, he fights by the book of arithmetic, according to Mercutio. The ease with which Romeo later kills Tybalt also proves Mercutio was right. He was in very little danger fighting Tybalt if only Romeo hadn't interfered. Which brings us to Mercutio's death. Here, Mercutio acts as an agent of fate. He calls a plague on both your houses, and it is a plague that interrupts the letter the friar sends to Romeo about Juliet's feigned death, that leads to Romeo believing that she's actually dead, buying the poison, killing himself. Eventual tragedy, and that all happens because of a plague, and we can argue that Mercutio brings that plague into the world of Verona through this curse, and so he's acting as an agent of fate here that will cause the death of the two lovers. Mercutio's ending his death also prepares us for when Romeo dies, because he acts as a sort of mirror to Romeo. Romeo is also going to refuse to accept responsibility for his actions. He will call himself Fortune's fool, as in he's just a victim of fate rather than taking responsibility. As we already saw in the quotations about Romeo, he's entirely responsible. So similarly, Mercutio blames the feud for his death rather than his impulsive need for a quarrel and his need to reject calm and choosing to be honourable in this male society following this masculine code of honour. We can't really say that Mercutio is a victim of the feud, nor even of the code of male honour. After all, defeating Tybalt himself would have done nothing to stop Romeo's vile submission, so it wouldn't have established Romeo's honour, and he didn't need to get involved in the feud at all. He's not part of the two families. So he is responsible for his own actions here. Mercutio's view of death is that there is no afterlife, the body is simply meat. However, Romeo has a much more romantic vision, and so the worms will act as chambermaids to Juliet, as though she's still alive in the afterlife, making her even more beautiful rather than reducing her to meat or to a skeleton. Although it's Romeo's vision that ends the play, and we might think that Shakespeare therefore wants to promote Romeo's perspective, Mercutio's vision may be more realistic. By counterpointing these two views of death, Shakespeare might be trying to show how pointless Romeo's suicide is, because it's based on a complete fantasy of what death will be like. The friar is a really interesting figure who we both reject and welcome. In Shakespeare's day, he would have been a suspicious character because he would have been a Catholic and the Catholic Church had been banned. However, he's often the voice of reason within the play, and so Shakespeare is taking a rather even-handed approach to him. When he says these violent delights have violent ends, he's predicting the future, that out of this violent love there will be violent death. He calls their passion for each other violent delights, linking love and death as the lovers do themselves. He foresees these violent ends and presumably means a sudden end to their love for each other once real life and time spent together get in the way. So we can see he views the lovers as misguided teenagers who are caught up in their own emotions and don't realise that those emotions will not last. But as always with Shakespeare, characters' words are used ironically, so the audience, knowing what happens to the lovers from the prologue, already know that these words actually invite the lovers' real deaths. His adult perspective is that the sweetest honey has to be had in moderation. Too much will make it loathsome. His language predicts that their love, which is so intense now, will burn itself out over time like fire and gunpowder. He's warning the lovers that their love feels real, but the sheer intensity of what they are feeling is proof that it cannot last. And the events of the play show that the friar is right. Now we come to the part of the friar that the audience is not supposed to approve of and not supposed to trust. It's the Catholic part. In the original source poem, the friar is presented as a hypocritical figure and an obvious villain. Here, that villainy is only suggested at the end of the play. When he goes to Juliet, she's just found Romeo dead beside her, and the friar's solution is to take her away and turn her into a nun. This is a woman who's just had sex for the first time with Romeo, who she's passionately in love with, and he thinks, or does he, that the solution is going to be to make her into a nun. So at the end of the play here, the friar actually reveals himself as a coward. He flees, runs away, rather than being caught with Juliet and the corpses of Romeo and Paris. But before he makes that decision to run, he offers Juliet this final solution. Rather than confess his own part in the marriage and his plan to drug Juliet to pretend that she was dead, he's going to get rid of her. He's going to cover up the evidence. He says, "I'll dispose of thee," as though she's rubbish. This language is extremely callous. He isn't offering to help her escape or to help her hide from her family. Instead, his words reveal that he's treating her and her future as refuse, something to be thrown away and disposed of. Now, although Juliet is religious, we can imagine Juliet is not attracted to living with holy nuns as a nun. Astonishingly, the prince simply accepts all the friar's motives were good, including the decision to marry Romeo and Juliet in the first place. He says, despite everything, "We still have known thee for a holy man." Shakespeare therefore doesn't tell us what to think about the friar. We know he's manipulative, but is he manipulative in a positive way or a negative one? He forces us to make up our own mind. It's highly unlikely you'll ever get a question on Tybalt on his own, and the most common question will link him to one of the other males in the play, most likely Mercutio, because they're sort of opposites, even though they have a lot of parallel characteristics, both being obsessed with honour and fighting. Tybalt's first words, "What, art thou drawn among these heartless hinds?" where a hind is a female deer, are very revealing about the social context of the play. But before we get into that, it's worth noting that Tybalt is unusual in that he's the only character in the play about whom there's nothing to like or sympathise with. He's unusual in the play because there aren't any conflicting aspects to his personality. He's simply two-dimensional. He seems to represent a particular kind of manhood, obsessed with status, with etiquette, and violence to prove his worth. He embodies everything that Shakespeare might have thought was wrong with the masculine code of honour, which included duelling as the ultimate expression of male status and skill. Shakespeare gives us his obsession with status when he dismisses the servants as heartless hinds. Their status is conveyed through animal imagery, making them less than human. Shakespeare also links the masculine code of honour to a patriarchal dismissal of women, and that's why Tybalt chooses to call them hinds, which are, of course, female deer, and therefore, being female, even lower status than an animal. Or perhaps we might argue an equal status. He is also an interesting counterpoint not just to Mercutio, but to Romeo. Romeo's love poetry in the play is used to suggest that he's playing at the role of being a lover. He's adopting a pose, which was made famous in Elizabethan England by Petrarch's sonnets. And you'll remember that Romeo actually composes a sonnet with Juliet when they first meet. Tybalt's threats also feel like a pose. He describes himself as death in a metaphor, as all-powerful and unstoppable, and when he tells Benvolio, "Look upon thy death." But Shakespeare has cunningly begun the play by showing all this fighting as being childish bravado. It's full of sexual innuendo and thumb-biting, which the audience would have found rather hilarious and infantile. So although Tybalt is desperate to prove his status as a man, everything he does undermines that status in the eyes of the audience, who simply see him as immature and childish. Tybalt also seems to invite his own death. He shares the same hubris, that arrogance against the gods, as Romeo did, where Romeo decided that he was going to go to the ball, even though he'd had this dream which told him there was a consequence hanging in the stars. Tybalt is the same. He's going against God here, and decides that it's not a sin to kill Romeo. This is perhaps the turning point which leads to Tybalt's death. The two previous brawls, mentioned by the prince, have involved some wounding, but no one got killed. Despite his claims to embody death, we can see that he is either not skilled enough as a swordsman to kill his opponent, or he actually doesn't intend to kill, despite his words. But now, here, he speaks in soliloquy. The convention in a Shakespeare play is that when characters speak in a soliloquy, they're speaking their true thoughts because their words aren't chosen for anyone else on stage to hear. Up until now, Tybalt's hate has all been directed generally at anyone who's a Montague, but now, in this moment, he is only focused on killing Romeo. So we can see this is Tybalt's moment of hubris, which causes his own tragic fate. God would certainly call killing Romeo a sin, but Tybalt justifies murder to himself, saying, "I hold it not a sin." And this challenge to God is made because he worships the stock and honour of my kin instead of worshipping his God. So the masculine attachment to honour and to the family feud becomes blasphemous, sacrilegious, and directly leads to Tybalt's death. Now we come to the nurse. Again, you're not likely to get the nurse as a single character on her own. She's most likely to be linked with Juliet. So here she's remembering what her dead husband said when Juliet was only about 3 years old and fell down face first and knocked her head, causing a massive bump. The nurse, as you probably know, is obsessed with sex. What does Shakespeare intend of us to make about the nurse? Well, if we go back to the source poem, the nurse there is a terrible gossip who gets banished herself at the end of the play. Well, you know that Shakespeare changes that ending here, because Shakespeare really wants to explore the nurse as a real person, as a member of the servant class. Although he still uses all the servants in the play for comedy, Shakespeare also uses them to explore real social issues of the time. And here, the social issue he's most concerned about is the patriarchal control of women, and in this quotation, they are controlled simply as a way of breeding heirs. Juliet's role is going to be to marry and then reproduce, give sons to her husband. This is why it's the nurse's husband who laughs at Juliet as a 3-year-old and begins talking to her as a 3-year-old about her role to have sex by falling on her back when she's older and has a bit more wit, a bit more cunning and intelligence. He actually presents sex as a cure for the pain of falling on her face, as falling on her back will be more pleasurable. The nurse still finds this hilarious because she is herself obsessed with sex, and particularly looks forward to Juliet losing her virginity. Remember, she actually says, go seek happy nights to happy days. So she's excited for Juliet. Now, Juliet's reaction is interesting. She says, I, agreeing that when she has more wit, she will fall backwards. We know Shakespeare loves irony. As a 3-year-old, Juliet didn't know what the nurse's husband meant, but now she does. And so Juliet is suggesting she is going to use her wit to marry Romeo, and she falls backwards in order to consummate the wedding. And this strongly suggests she uses her own sexuality to lure Romeo into marrying her. So we get the idea that the urge to marry young has been cultivated in her since she was a toddler, and this helps explain why she's in such a rush to marry. Shakespeare wants us to be critical not of her decision to marry, because it makes sense in many ways as an escape from having to marry Paris, whom she doesn't love, but also to criticise the upbringing which has made this possible. Now, we might expect the nurse as a woman to be looking out for Juliet's interest, but this is the feature of the patriarchal society. It so brainwashed the women in it that they have to opt in to those patriarchal power relationships because they can only get power through their relationships with men. This is how the nurse introduces Juliet to Romeo. So the nurse has imbibed this patriarchal view of women, and immediately she equates Juliet with money. So even she is not seeing Juliet as a whole person in her own right. She's still bought into this idea of women as a commodity. Shakespeare wants us to understand more than that. Love, he implies, is never just love in a patriarchal society. The nurse voices the social opinion that the most important part of courtship isn't love, it's financial. She portrays Juliet as property that a suitor like Romeo can lay hold of, a metaphor which makes us think of possession again. And then she points out the value of that property as being worth the chinks. So we can see the nurse has bought into this patriarchal way of thinking so far that she actually celebrates the idea of Juliet as being property because Juliet is such high value property. What might Shakespeare have wanted his audience to make of this? Perhaps for them to decide that the root of the tragedy isn't the feud at all, but Capulet's entitlement to choose a husband for his daughter. After all, if Capulet couldn't decide who Juliet's husband was going to be, there wouldn't be a tragedy, would there? And so the true cause of the tragedy is the patriarchal rules about how men control women. It's patriarchy that is the tragedy. Lady Capulet's created to be a counterpoint both to her husband and to Juliet. She points out how lucky Juliet is that she wasn't married at the age that Lady Capulet was married, younger than Juliet. Well, think of marriage now. Younger than you, here in Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. So here she's telling Juliet, look, we've already shown that we're not in a rush because girls who are a younger 13 or maybe even 12 have already been married and also already got pregnant and also already given birth. By my count, I was your mother much upon these years that you are now a maid. So it's quite clear Juliet's mother had already given birth to Juliet by the time she was Juliet's age. Thus then in brief, the valiant Paris seeks you for his love. And the addition of in brief also shows us what a rush she's actually in to get Juliet to marry Paris, even while she's pretending that Juliet will just be able to check him out at the ball and make up her own mind. Because Lady Capulet values status so highly, she uses status as her main argument to persuade Juliet. She tells her that daughters younger than you are already ladies of esteem, in other words, having really high status. And she's contrasting their age to ladies to suggest that this is the only way Juliet is going to be able to gain status as an adult, through marriage. And look at the subtle addition of by my count, because who is Paris? He is the county Paris. You see the subliminal messaging that's going on here. Lady Capulet's imagery also includes an element of competition, pointing out to Juliet that she's got young rivals who are getting ahead of her socially. In other words, she's telling Juliet, look, if you hang about any longer, all the desirable rich men from good families will have been snapped up by girls younger than you. What are you playing at, daughter? She also points out, as we have seen, that these ladies of esteem are already mothers. She suggests that Juliet's age is old for a mother, and proves it by reminding her that she herself had Juliet when she was Juliet's age. So the contrast with Capulet is really stark. He's probably realised that this was a mistake in his own marriage, and that could be why he's told Paris to wait 2 more summers. Finally, as we just saw, she is abrupt and businesslike. When she tells Juliet about Paris, she doesn't bother to find attractive reasons to recommend him. Instead, she's just really cold and just says, thus then, in brief. And this tone implies that it's Juliet's duty to marry young, to immediately get pregnant and marry whoever her parents pick for her. Now, the second quotation about Lady Capulet is one that you've probably not even noticed is in the play. You need to know that mouse hunt was slang for having affairs. So what she's saying to her husband here is, yes, you have been having affairs in your time when you were younger, but I'm going to watch you from now on. This is the first time that Lady Capulet thinks that she can keep an eye on her husband and stop him having sex with other women. It's no coincidence that these lines about Capulet's affairs happen as the parents are helping to prepare the feasts for Juliet's wedding. Shakespeare is using this to point out the one-sided nature of marriage, where the husband doesn't just get to possess the bride and all her money, her dowry, and her virginity, and her ability to breed heirs for him, but he also feels perfectly entitled to carry on having affairs in a mouse hunt. It's only now that her husband is nearly 50 and she's only about 26 that she feels she'll be able to prevent him from having further affairs. She emphasises this with the word now, perhaps meaning that without any children left at home, she will at last be able to focus fully on her husband and finally achieve some status as an equal to him within the household. He will no longer be able to get away with having affairs. And the other thing here is, if he's a man of about 50, he's unlikely to meet women who are more sexually attractive than his own wife, who's only 26. And that suggests that men in this society are having affairs simply because it's expected of them. That's how the patriarchal society appears to work. As we've seen, the phrase mouse hunt also plays down the betrayal in these affairs. We see that Lady Capulet has had to shrug them off, so they won't cause her pain. But clearly they have, because she's now looking forward to them ending. At 26, she is no longer just the cover to his golden book, as she described Juliet being to Paris. She is also the gold clasps that lock him into the marriage at last. Benvolio is a counterpoint to Tybalt in that there's probably nothing that we would dislike about him, although perhaps you could if you knew him better. So here Benvolio is telling Romeo to forget Rosaline because her love is like a poison that is infecting his eye. Now, unfortunately, eye infections such as these were a result of sexually transmitted diseases. So the undertone here is that Romeo is lucky to have escaped having sex with Rosaline because he could have got a sexually transmitted disease. That is the kind of laddish humour that they're indulging in. But that is a subtext. What he's actually saying here is that love is like an infection, and it infects your eye because you see something beautiful and you automatically fall in love with it. He's suggesting then that Romeo's love is not real, it's not authentic. He's just falling in love with the first beautiful thing he sees. And then he's saying, well, if you see something else that infects your eye in the same way, then you will fall in love with that woman and forget about Rosaline. Now, although this seems incredibly cynical, it's actually totally accurate, because that's exactly what Romeo does. So Benvolio's words actually seem wise. He takes the opposite view of love to Romeo. He sees the emotions of being in love as an infection because it alters the personality. And this, remember, was also Mercutio's objection to Romeo's love. Like the friar, he sees that the lover simply falls in love with beauty, rather than their personality or their inherent worth. When love is unrequited, that infection becomes a rank poison. He proposes the solution to this is simply to find a more attractive woman to fall in love with, presumably until eventually he might find one who returns his affections. In Mercutio, this description of love would feel cynical, but because Shakespeare has taken the trouble to present Benvolio as the mature peacemaker, remember, peace, put up your swords, who is also trusted by Romeo's parents, they send him off to find out what's wrong with Romeo. Shakespeare therefore asks us to consider if Benvolio's view of young male love is also a mature perspective. In other words, does he want the audience to agree with Benvolio's view and be more dismissive of the passion of Juliet and Romeo as immature and, in the friar's words, loathsome in its own deliciousness? Benvolio's common sense is also apparent in all the fights in the play. Here he spends a lot of time trying to protect Mercutio from his own desire for violence and the consequences of that. Remember, the prince was going to execute anyone who started another fight. So once Mercutio draws his sword ready to fight Tybalt, Benvolio intervenes. He tries to reframe the duel by pointing out, "We talk." Now that's just a completely different idea than "we're fighting." And so he's trying to de-escalate this moment when they've both got their swords out, ready to attack each other. And he ignores that and says, no, we talk here in the public haunt of men. Not we argue, not we duel, not we're about to kill each other. He just calms everything down with his language choice. It's a subtle way of de-escalating the violence. He points out that this is a public place to help them remember the prince's promised punishment to further public brawls. He describes it as a haunt of men. Well, why does he use the word haunt? Because it carries the connotation of death. And so that's another subtle reminder of what will happen, what the consequences are if they fight. He also contrasts the heat of the day, which he warned about earlier, with reason coldly. He's desperate to pour cold water, metaphorically, to get them to cool down, metaphorically, without violence. But because his voice represents the adult world, Mercutio and Tybalt ignore it. And that's why Benvolio is a model of what masculinity should be, and Mercutio and Tybalt are models of what masculinity shouldn't be. Now let's look at Romeo. Which one is he more like? Well, unfortunately, he's much more like Mercutio and Tybalt, and so Shakespeare uses Benvolio to suggest that he is the superior version of Romeo. Those quotations will link to any single essay that could possibly come up in the exam. If you would like to learn the examiner's secrets of how to do brilliantly in your essay writing, check out the video appearing now.